Uh, Our first speaker of the day is Kari, the Assistant Director for Education and Outreach at the Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection at Michigan State. Kari has testified before the U.S. and House Senate Judiciary Committees, and today she'll be exploring trends in counterfeiting, how it's woven into other online crime, and how regulators are dealing with it. Let's follow the money with her. All that glitters is not gold. Kari, thank you so much for spending time with us. I really appreciate it.
Melissa, thanks so much, and thanks to EverC for the invitation. Great to see you all this morning. As Melissa mentioned, I'm the director of the Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection. We are a multidisciplinary research center based at Michigan State University. We've been around for about 15 years, studying this interesting problem of trademark counterfeiting, as well as brand protection and what that looks like for intellectual property rights holders, both on the civil but also the criminal side, and in the US as well as globally. So if I can get my slides up, I think that would be great. And I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about what we have seen sort of transition in the last 6 or 7 years, but more rapidly in the last 4 years. You can go ahead and move that to the next one. Traditionally, we saw trademark counterfeiting come up in, a lot of things such as, markets or flea markets, bodegas, things like that. And that was basically the sale of a good that took the trademark of a legitimate company and put it on a product that did not belong to them. We have seen that rapidly transition with the advent of online sales, as I'm sure most people who are on this session know, to e-commerce, also social media, but also places too like the dark web. With the advent of these wonderful technologies that we all use to do shopping, to get things more quickly than we might normally, or even to get goods that aren't sold in the geographic area that we live in, we've also seen bad actors jump onto this and realize that there is a lot of potential for them to make a lot of profit off of this in ways that they never could before. Next slide, please. So just to clarify, because we get a lot of questions about exactly what is trademark counterfeiting, what does that look like? So I'm going to go through just a couple quick examples of products that we've either had in our office or have been used by partners of ours, or we have, some of these images. So for example, a consumer buys a product. This is a makeup product. The one on the left happens to be authentic. The one on the right is a counterfeit, but they take the packaging, they take the product itself in some cases, and apply what is pretty close to a trademark of the actual brand. So when a consumer gets it, they're not able often to tell what exactly the product is. Is it a counterfeit? Is it a genuine product? Maybe if they do a side-by-side comparison, they might see. But what we're seeing is that the level of sophistication with counterfeits is now evolving. Counterfeits are very, very good in some cases. They're not always the traditional, what we know as very low quality handbags or low quality luxury goods. When we think of like a Louis Vuitton bag that's being sold for $20, and by a street vendor, those still exist, but what we're seeing now has expanded incredibly. Not only do we see counterfeiting of companies that are consumer facing, so B2C companies, we also see counterfeiting of products that are B2B companies. So a lot of manufacturing parts, things like that, electronics, different types of goods like that. Next slide, please. So just a couple other examples of what we're seeing too. Pharmaceuticals right now are one of those groups that is highly counterfeited and for the most part pretty easy to counterfeit. I'll talk about this a little bit later in my presentation, but a lot of these counterfeits of pharmaceuticals are bought knowingly, which was a big surprise to all of us when we did some research on it. I mean, we've heard of this depending on which country you're based in, but a lot of people were buying the fake product in hopes that it would have some of the active ingredients that are in the real product. And then a lot of other cases, these pharmaceuticals are just flat out counterfeit and sold to someone who thinks that they are a legitimate product. There are a lot of reasons for this. As you can see in this particular example, we're talking about pills. It's very easy to buy a pill press, put some stuff in it that doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it sort of looks like it, and now ship it to the consumer. And again, something like pharmaceuticals was not traditionally bought online, but we're seeing the explosion of online pharmacies. And there's a lot of organizations that are working, especially in the pharmaceutical industry to keep not only counterfeit pharmaceuticals off the streets, but also off of online platforms and even social media platforms. We hear from our partners in the pharma space that, it's not just a traditional sale of a pharmaceutical, for example, on like an e-commerce site, but a lot of those that are in the field of counterfeiting pharmaceuticals will break in to, for example, interest groups on social media. So like a cancer survivor group, or a cancer someone who's going through cancer and is trying to connect with other people who are going through the same experience. And the counterfeiters will infiltrate that group and say, hey, we have this place where you can get meds cheaper, this will work better, all of these things, and then leading them to a place where they can buy counterfeits. Next, please. Another industry that we see highly counterfeited is the toy industry. And as we come up again, on the holidays, where at least in the US, we have high levels of consumer purchases of toys, we see these made without safety standards at all. They may look similar to the genuine product, but with the companies that we've worked with in the toy industry, we see we see this sort of pervasively across different product lines, different companies, that they're poor quality. And in fact, in these cases, they're not just poor quality, but they're dangerous to children. Many children have been injured, in some cases killed, by some of the counterfeit toy products that we see. Next, please. And even something such as office products, we see, counterfeits. Here is a counterfeit and a genuine side by side. It's very challenging to see, which one is which, especially if you're ordering again online and it's coming to you in the mail. Next slide. Another industry where we see this across the board, and this spills over into a lot of other issues around food fraud, is food counterfeiting. So in this case, we often see that the packaging is counterfeit. In this case, again, you see a side by side of a counterfeit and a genuine product. But we also don't know what food is actually in those products. Is it actually cereal? Is it something made out of sawdust? What could that possibly be? And those are often connected to other types of food fraud as well. So for example, saying, a meat is beef, but in fact it is not, it's another animal, or something to that effect. So we'll see a lot of crossover in the food industry with other types of food fraud. But again, the point of it is to be able to sell a product to a consumer. The consumer thinks it's that product, or is close enough to the product. Other industries that we see, that I haven't really mentioned, but, car parts, aerospace, semiconductor industry, electronics, the list goes on and on and on. And what we have learned from our work at the center is that if you have a successful product in market with a trademark on it, chances are you're going to be counterfeited. And if you feel that you haven't been, or you feel that there isn't a threat, maybe you haven't found it yet, but it's probably out there. From what we see counterfeiters are very entrepreneurial. They are very quick to pivot because, of course, they don't have to deal with the laws and regulations that a genuine company does, or a legitimate company who has to register their intellectual property rights, who has to go through whatever type of regulatory testing exists. We see them able to pivot very quickly, particularly online now. The feedback they get from consumers, from reviews in some cases, and even in some cases platforms, telling them why we've rejected a certain product because it had these flaws in it, or it was obvious to us that it was counterfeit for these reasons, is enough for them to go back and adjust their packaging or adjust their product. And again, they only need to do as much as possible to make the sale. And then after the point of sale, consumers can't find where they're, where they bought it from. So we've seen this phenomenon, really explode in the past 4 to 5 years, where a consumer will buy a product off e-commerce or social media. They get hurt by the product. They realize it's a counterfeit. It falls apart. All of these different things that will happen once they get it. And once they try to reach out to the seller disappears. They work with the platform to try to find the seller, and we know it's very challenging then to find it. And oftentimes the sellers are cross jurisdictional boundaries, so they're selling from another country, and maybe they list an address that's not real, or a company name that's not real, And I'll talk about that in a few minutes, at least with the newer US laws that have been passed and are introduced into the US Congress for hoping to stem some of those issues of the disappearing third-party sellers. So next slide, please. I did want to talk a little bit too about the supply chain. And of course, this is a rudimentary graphic of a supply chain. Most companies' supply chains are incredibly complex, you know, and involve many things. But, you know, we often talk about this to give people an idea of what's happening behind the scene. So on the blue arrows here are, again, a rudimentary legitimate supply chain, which starts with the idea of a product from a company and the R&D, the registration of their intellectual property, getting all of the materials that they're going to use for manufacturing, going through the manufacturing process and the packaging process, all the way from distribution to the point of retail, whether that's to another business or industry or whether that's to a consumer. But what we see on the illicit side with the illicit supply chain is the counterfeiters will take that idea and that IP, and they'll essentially like rip the idea or rip the IP from the IP rights holder and go through their own parallel manufacturing, packaging, distribution, wholesale site. So back when this was traditionally brick and mortar, you wouldn't often see, you know, a counterfeit and a genuine product being sold to the consumer in the same marketplace. It did happen from time to time, but it was usually an infiltration of a counterfeit product into the legitimate supply chain somehow, that the counterfeiter would manage to insert product into that legitimate supply chain. But now with online sales, we see just this parallel path, and then we see in the marketplaces online those products being sold next to each other, making it very difficult for whoever is purchasing that to distinguish, is this a legitimate seller? Is this not a legitimate seller? How do we look at that? Next slide, please. And this can be further complicated by things such as gray market, other things such as diverted product, which complicates things even further. So gray market is not criminal activity, but it's more of a contract violation between the company and a distributor. But this can become very complex. So when you look now at an online marketplace, you can have a mix of genuine product, gray market product, diverted product, pure counterfeit, but also even, you know, product from organized retail crime. That's a legitimate product, but it's stolen and being sold in the marketplace. So this is a very complicated issue for platforms to deal with, for social media platforms to deal with, but also for IP rights holders and those of us trying to research, you know, this phenomenon and what it looks like. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about the harm, you know, that happens, but I think it's always a good reminder for all of us that work in this field is that, yes, this is criminal activity. The sale and manufacturing of counterfeits is criminal activity, but why is it happening? And that is counterfeiters want profit. I've read some statistics that counterfeiting, the profit from counterfeiting globally has now surpassed that of the illicit drug trade. Or even, you know, human trafficking globally. So we know that for the most part, this is low risk for criminal actors. A lot of law enforcement agencies don't prioritize this. A lot of countries now have particular intellectual property enforcement agencies within their larger law enforcement, and customs, for example, is often involved. Some version of their judiciary and what that looks like takes on maybe some special prosecutions and things like that. But often at the local level, it's very challenging to get local law enforcement anywhere in the world to take some of these cases. So a quick example of the US. In the US, counterfeiting is criminalized at the federal level and also civilly. It's not criminalized, but you can bring a civil suit against someone who's counterfeiting your product, but also with all 50 states. So all 50 states in the US have civil and criminal anti-counterfeiting legislation. But in one of our studies a few years ago, only 26 or 27 of those states had even used the criminal legislation to go after counterfeiters, which is just a very interesting note. Next slide, please. So talking about criminal activity, we've run a couple studies over the years looking at connected criminal activity to trademark counterfeiting. And we know, again, because it's very much a profit motivated crime, that oftentimes the profits from counterfeiting are used to fuel other types of illicit activity. So we know there's a huge connection to organized crime, particularly depending on which market we're talking about, which jurisdiction, which country. There's a connection in some cases to a lot of illicit drug activity and other things. In some cases, it's connected to terrorism, and it's been used to fund terrorist activities. And then we also see it now, particularly in the last, I would say, year 1 to 3 years, really getting connected into other types of online fraud. Probably since the onset of COVID, online fraud dealing with everything from cyber threats to theft of personal information, credit card information. In some cases, there'll be counterfeit product listings, but the person will go in and purchase them, and they'll never even get a product. In some cases, I think the bad actors are realizing they don't even need to create a product as long as they can get that credit card information and go from there. So we definitely see an overlap in ways that we've never seen, and we never saw in the brick and mortar environment. And I think for us, it's very important that all of these different groups that are working together specifically to deal with these types of online criminal activity are aware and are working together, because again, all of these are overlapping. And if we stay siloed, if we in the brand protection space and anti-trademark counterfeiting space are only working on those issues, we tend to not see what's going on with other types of cyber criminality, and other types of online theft and online crime. Next slide, please. So I did want to talk a bit now about the consumer impact specifically, because I think this is very interesting. It's been very eye-opening even for us. I mean, we've heard a lot of anecdotal stories over the years from various brands about some of their consumers were injured, some of them were killed, or they have monetary loss. But I did want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. And we have just completed in September our first really major online consumer survey looking specifically at the online sale of counterfeit goods. So next slide, please. I did want to start out by giving you some of the statistics that we found from the survey. So this particular stat comes from the US. So 1 out of 10 participants in the US said they've had a negative health effect after they bought and used a counterfeit product. 15% said they experienced a personal injury. So those might not seem like very high numbers, but when we think about some of the statistics of how many people are doing online shopping these days, it's pretty staggering that this many people are saying they were injured or have received negative health effects. I mean, this has become a real threat to health and safety, particularly now because it's not just limited to the luxury goods industry or even clothing and apparel, although we also know from working with those industries too that there can be very negative health effects, even from buying a counterfeit shirt, for example, or counterfeit jewelry or something that is not made up to the standards of that particular industry. And then the other negative consequences, again, go back to the money issue. So consumers noted they have a loss of money and their personal information has been compromised, which again goes to confirm, what we know about sort of this intersection of criminality. Next slide, please. So the details of our consumer study are available on the ACAP website for those who are interested. There is an executive summary there, and the larger report is about 251 pages long, so it's pretty long if anyone is really interested in diving deep. But we did look at 17 countries in multiple languages and ask specifically what is their experience in online shopping, and have they bought counterfeits intentionally or have they bought them accidentally? And what does that look like? And looking for patterns across multiple countries and multiple regions. Some have come through and have shown us that, like, yes, there are multiple patterns that exist across boundaries. And then in other places, we see consumer behavior varies from country to country, depending on what that is. Next slide, please. So for example, from the survey, these were some interesting statistics for us. So 52% have non-deceptively bought counterfeits at least once in the last year, meaning they intentionally went out looking for counterfeit goods and purchased a good at least once. 68%, and these are global stats, were basically duped into buying a counterfeit at least once in the past year, which is a pretty high percentage. And then 21% are frequent buyers of counterfeit product intentionally, meaning they go online regularly, they're constantly looking for counterfeit product, and they purchase it. And then 38% decided to keep it and essentially use it even after they learned they were buying a counterfeit good, which is really interesting. So some of the results we received from the survey lead us to the fact that we know that consumers don't really know what to do when they purchase a counterfeit. If we think about consumer education in the context of many other types of criminal activity over the years, consumers often know what they should do if something happens, but we find in the online space they're not really sure what to do. We see some of them, attempted to complain to the platform. They attempted to complain to the manufacturer. A couple, very few, went to report to law enforcement. But many of them don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to deal, with any of these issues that they're seeing online. And they also don't have a lot of cyber education to some extent. I mean, some, yes, are very savvy, but many don't know how to navigate it. They know enough to be able to buy a product, but beyond that, not so much. Next slide, please. So the other interesting thing that we pulled from the survey is, where are consumers purchasing these counterfeit products? So one of the interesting notes is that around 40% were buying from e-retail platforms as well as social media platforms, and the remainder were still buying from brick and mortar environments. I mean, so this confirms essentially what we already know, which is the online space is ripe, for abuse from counterfeiters looking to take advantage of all of the good things that platforms and social media platforms have done for business, right? This ability to reach consumers that had never existed before, ability to reach consumers in different marketplaces, to get product to consumers quickly. Counterfeiters have recognized that as, they will try to also take advantage of that too. Next slide, please. So just an interesting statistic, and this was globally, about who was more likely to buy counterfeit. And one of the reasons why we drilled down on this was because a lot of anti-counterfeiting messaging that's directed towards consumers is very general. And we believe that if there can be more specific targeted messaging in the places where individuals are purchasing, whether that is on the platform, whether that is during the financial transaction that they have, maybe with a payment processor or something else, that can target, who is making these purchases, and perhaps ways to either educate or deter, depending on whether they're there to look intentionally for the purchase of counterfeits, or whether it's accidental and they think they're actually buying a legitimate product, from a legitimate e-commerce site, but indeed it's a bad actor who's slipped through all of the precautions that the platforms have taken. Next slide, please. We also were a bit surprised by this particular finding, which is, we often talk about consumers going out to basically say they want to get a deal, so they're going to buy the cheapest thing ever. So that's called an economic benefit motive, which we did see, but we also found pretty high numbers with hedonic motives, value expressive motives, in social adjusted motives, which basically say they enjoy counterfeit shopping and buying, and they, in some cases, said it expressed their values and what that looked like. So it's really interesting too, then, how that would affect messaging targeted at consumers, that it's not just about buying the cheapest product out there, although that sometimes is a factor, but there's these other factors too that can be used in targeting messaging at consumers and educating them in order to sway their response. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing too, and again, you can read more about this in our study, is that peer behavior and perception was a major impact. So if someone saw that their friends or family online were purchasing counterfeit, it had a major impact on whether they would or would not. The other thing too is that the perception of risk, in many cases, they were aware of the risk, but they would still go through with it, which we don't necessarily see with other types of behavior. They perceive that they could, in many cases, those who were accidentally buying counterfeit could tell, and were very confident in themselves that they could purchase legitimate product and would know whether a counterfeit product was indeed counterfeit or not. But then when you look at the responses of how many bought counterfeit accidentally, that number was much higher. So it's interesting. So you see, for example, a 1-unit increase in hedonic motives, perceived behavioral control, and perceived threat susceptibility, with these factors looking at that. And for anyone who's interested in more details, I know there's a lot more information in this particular report around this, and what some of these jumps and unit increases are, depending on, in some cases, the demographics of the individuals that were being surveyed. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit about new technologies and artificial intelligence. I know there are probably a lot more experts in the room right now on AI than I am. But something that's really interesting that we've seen, over the 15 years that the center has been around, and hearing from those who've been in the field for much longer, is that whenever a new technology comes up and we see it being used in the field of intellectual property enforcement or anti-counterfeiting, it's usually we see a lot of very reactive and responsive approaches to it. I'll talk in a minute too about what that looks like when that can be a little bit more proactive and a little bit more integrated. And we hear about how AI is a wonderful tool, similar to e-commerce and social media, in order to have technological progress. But we also see too that it can be a threat to IP. We see that particularly in the online space when AI or machine learning, some of these algorithms are basically encouraging or putting out information that would lead to an IP violation. It becomes pretty complicated. We also hear from a lot of our partners too that some of the bad actors are using AI to target which ports to import counterfeit goods into. So they're monitoring where for example, there's been a higher enforcement level from customs, whether that's in the US or another country. But they're using AI to basically tell which ports have the least amount of monitoring of counterfeit goods, and maybe focused on other issues. So this is a big issue that a lot of people are speaking about in our community, as they are in many communities. But for us, this is a very interesting question: is how do you perceive AI both as a tool, but also a potential threat if it gets into the hands of bad actors? And then how do you regulate around that? How can we maybe pass a law, maybe not, maybe come up with a community of best practices, but how can we be aware of what's happening, both reactively but also proactively? Next slide, please. So these approaches and how we look at technology, but also how we look at criminality, from our research says that those approaches should be strategic. They should be proactive, although they necessarily have to deal with reactive efforts when something is occurring immediately, and a fire has to be put out or a situation has to be addressed. But they also should be holistic. When brand protection, for example, is housed in a company and a brand, they're often housed in a particular department, such as the legal department, sometimes engineering, sometimes security. We find that in some companies that function can be siloed. And again, before, as I was mentioning, how we need collaboration in this space, even within a company, some of those traditional silos need to be knocked down, and whoever's dealing with the issue of IP enforcement or brand protection should be working across the board, probably working with IT, working with those in supply chain, working with those in purchasing, to make sure that this is a very holistic, cross-company endeavor, to protect the IP of the company, but also to deal with some of these converging threats that we might see in the online space. Next slide, please. So some of the ways that can be done, and we've seen this, by different organizations, both on the IP rights holders side and the brand side, but also by those working with them too. And one of those important things is a risk assessment for counterfeit products or other threats related to the sale of their goods in the counterfeit space. And one of the important findings of when one does one of these risk assessments is to see across the company where the weaknesses, where are the gaps, where are the places that counterfeiters or other bad actors can exploit what's going on. I mean, we see this being used in the cybersecurity space frequently, but oftentimes when people are dealing with intellectual property, they tend to not focus on that. Next slide. The next one that I will just reiterate, because this is so important, is partnerships. Partnerships between all of the players in the online supply chain, between the IP rights holders, between law enforcement and government. I can't emphasize enough public-private partnerships, but I would also say with academia too. So sometimes we have the luxury of being able to step back and look at some of these problems without having to, address them in real time, like everybody else who's working, actively in this field. But partnerships, we've seen some very successful partnerships. One that, some that we've seen, and two that we've been a part of that are really looking to deal with this issue and to deal with it in a holistic way. Everybody has a role to play in these partnerships, and we can't stem the tide of this without collaboration, without partnerships. Next slide, please. And again, education and awareness, not only important to consumers, but also within your own organizations. We found that very successful companies are very good at doing this type of organization. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the US laws that are looking to hopefully help this issue of the online sale of counterfeit goods. And I will just talk about them briefly because I want to leave enough time for some questions at the end. So next slide, please. So I mentioned briefly that counterfeiting is criminalized under federal law in the US, which is the Trademark Counterfeiting Act, and the Lanham Act is the civil one. The US Tariff Act gives customs the authority to seize goods, and there are also state laws. Next slide, please. But one area that's still pending is the space of secondary liability. So it's the question of, can anybody within the supply chain be liable for the sale of counterfeit goods, which is primarily the Shop Safe Act. And then Informed Consumers is a little bit different. It does not posit secondary liability, but could be a cause of action for state attorney generals or also the FTC. Next slide. So this is something that we've written a lot on. For those who are interested, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share this. So this is based off a criminological theory, but looking at how can we, through the law or through other mechanisms, disrupt the place and time where the counterfeiter meets the seller. So in the brick and mortar environment, it's a little bit easier. In the online environment, it takes someone basically keeping out bad actors, making sure the space where the sale of the goods is safe for consumers, but then also the education of consumers who are the target for this good. And the theory is, if you can disrupt one of these, protect the consumer, protect the place, or keep out the sale of counterfeits, then the sale never takes place. We talk a lot about what this looks like after the fact. So after a posting has already been up and thousands of goods have been sold and doing the traditional notice and takedown. But this theory looks at preventative measures, proactive measures for dealing with that. Next slide, please.
Hey, Kari, we had a question come in. If you don't mind, I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
One of the listeners asked, isn't the Supreme Court slowly dismantling the Lanham Act?
I don't know if I can answer that question. Because I am not an expert on the larger Lanham Act, mostly around just the portions involving trademark counterfeiting. So I'm going to have to punt on that question. So.
Let's do this. To the person that asked this question, Kari and I will take this offline and circle back with you directly with a little bit of research. Thanks for the question. Thanks, Kari.
Thank you. Yep, no problem. So a little bit about informed consumers, which is meant to get identifying information of sellers, which are high volume third-party sellers. And as I mentioned, that if those provisions are not followed through, there can be action by the FTC or state law enforcement. But the idea is that there's a lot of third-party sellers right now that are selling, and we don't know who they are. We don't have any identifying information for them. We don't know their names. We don't have contact information. So again, if a consumer is injured or an IP rights holder wants to find them, service of process has been nearly impossible, right, to even find who they are. There are a lot of limitations. Actually, next slide, please. I think this one talks about the limitations. There are a lot of limitations and gaps with this, of course. So we know that there's ID fraud, right? And of course, people, might be able to and do create fictional names, fictional websites, addresses, things like that. But the idea is that this is the first basic bar for having some information about these third-party sellers. Will it stop counterfeiting? I don't think so, no. Will it give more transparency to who's selling online? Yes. I mean, we have similar types of environments here in the brick and mortar space where, for example, if you have a mall, the person who's managing the mall knows who owns the stores in the mall and who's selling them. Obviously, this is much easier to enforce and to get, identifying documentation. But the theory is that this can be done in the online space too. So this law was passed last December, went into effect in June, sort of yet to be seen what this is going to look like in reality. And I think it's going to be, as many things, a learning process, and probably, we'll go to some litigation to determine what exactly the law means and what some of the provisions mean. Next slide, please.
Hey, Kari, we had another question come in if you want to take it. You ready?
Yep.
Excellent. This one is, I'm seeing increases in the occurrence of customizing issues where copywritten goods are changed by other companies. Are these included in the same figures and legal restrictions?
So customization is a complicated question, right? Both in the copyright space and also the trademark space. And I think a lot of those end up coming down to litigation, right? So how much of the copyrighted good or how much of the trademark good is being used? And what does that look like as far as the ability to enforce, usually in the civil side, right? I don't know of any criminal cases around that, but on the civil side, I know there's been several lawsuits about what exactly does that look like? How much, at least for copyright, how much is fair use? What can be used? But what exactly would that look like? So I think that's it's a little bit different because informed consumers is talking specifically about the sale of goods, and in this case, consumer goods.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep. So ShopSafe was just reintroduced a couple weeks ago into the Congress. It's a piece of bipartisan legislation in the US that's basically taking the next step to inform consumers, which is shifting the responsibility from IP rights holders and what we would call service providers. So those companies that basically search the web, e-commerce, social media, looking for counterfeit postings, to say that marketplaces or anyone who's selling to consumers has to proactively attempt to prevent counterfeit postings from going up and to take down those who they can discover are frequent sellers, basically, of counterfeit products. So this is going to shift a lot of what the current balance is, which rests right now under a Second Circuit 2010 case called Tiffany versus eBay. So we'll see. This is the third time this bill has been introduced, and we'll see this time, if it passes. But there's a lot of discussion around that. Next slide, please. So proactive enforcement too, is not just for e-commerce platforms or social media platforms, but as we know on the online supply chain, there's a lot of other actors that are there. Again, when we work with anybody, whether that's an IP rights holder, you know, any you know, anyone who's in the e-commerce supply chain, you know, whoever that may be, we focus very much on what are the proactive activities you can do. How can we prevent this as much as we can, and then use our reactive strategies to deal with what gets through. I think for a long time, there's been a lot of focus on just reacting to what this looks like, but I think this is a great time when collaboratively we can all work together to say, how can we proactively look at this problem? You know, what does a domain name provider need, maybe from an IP rights holder, in order to proactively, you know, screen for something or take that down? What does that look like on the payment processing side? You know, where does the money go once a counterfeiter, you know, sells 1,000 goods on an e-commerce site? You know, how can those accounts, regardless of where they are, can they be seized? Can they be blocked? What does that look like? We know that over the years, there's been some successful litigation, you know, seizing different payment providers' accounts by IP rights holders. But again, that's changing very quickly, and what that looks like and some of the strategies from 10 years ago, you know, don't work the same way they do today. Next slide, please. So looking forward, again, we hope to, you know, encourage collaboration, and sort of the interconnectedness of all of this type of criminal activity should at least, you know, lend us to working together more. And when I say us, anyone who this issue touches upon. And again, as much as we can always stress collaboration, we do. We're very happy to work with those who are looking to really, you know, impossible to end this crime, but basically to mitigate it, and to proactively be able to deal with some of these issues, to make it safer for consumers, safer for IP rights holders, you know, safer for the economy. So with that, I'll pause. I know I just have a couple minutes left to see if there's any additional questions.
The original person who asked about the Supreme Court also sent an article about the case that's moving through, and it specifically mentions it. So you and I will follow up after the session on that. Any questions from the audience? Your presentation was outstanding. Your stats were very fascinating. Certainly in the area of the people doing it on purpose, intentionally buying it, seeking pleasure out of buying it. That's a fascinating uncovering.
Yeah, it was a bit surprising for us. We knew there's a certain part of the population, for example, that goes out and actively tries to buy dupes, but it was a bigger number than we anticipated. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let me ask you this. The slideshow that you presented, we can share this with the audience. Yes, is that okay?
Yep, we can do that.
Okay, outstanding. Somebody just said, not a question, but seconding. Great presentation. Outstanding. Thank you for that. Let's see. Could not agree more. Whole new era for me. So learned a lot. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Thumbs up on everything. Oh, interesting. Here's one. I'm trying to find the newest methods of advertising for counterfeiting goods. TikTok was recently detected. What other new mediums have you seen?
Yeah, so TikTok is a big one, of course, but all social media is to some extent, right? So, and it's not as always clear cut as one might imagine. I mean, we know there's a lot that is an ad that then is linked to an external website or to a WhatsApp number, and the transaction is done sort of in this secured area. But as I mentioned, one of the, to me, you know, really egregious ones is sort of infiltrating these social media groups that are interest groups, or, you know, I mean, for example, like a mom group that's looking at like the safest things for their babies, and they're coming in and saying, go to this link, or especially the ones around medical issues. You know, so it's there. I mean, we talk about the counterfeiter as the unseen competitor, right? So they're trying to compete with the legitimate brand, and they are creative, they are entrepreneurial, they are quick moving. So, you know, any new social media platform that comes up, we see, you know, we've seen it with some of the new e-commerce platforms that are overseas, like Temu. You know, so it happens very quickly and moves very quickly. And I would say the companies that are doing a lot of the work on online, you know, online looking for counterfeit postings, I mean, have their finger on the pulse of what's going on, because they're working across industries, across companies, across product lines, and they can really see, you know, I mean, every month there's something new. It happens so quickly now.
Yeah, we're anticipating a big push into the regulatory ad space coming from our finger on that pulse, and the tide is shifting. We're at time. You, my friend, are an outstanding human. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Anybody who listened in, if you would like Kari's email address or contact information, reach out to us. We're happy to share it. We'll be sharing her presentation as well. You, my friend, take care of yourself, be safe, and thank you for participating.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate it.